Imagine stepping out of your front door into a wall of darkness so thick you can't see your own hand. The air isn't just cold, it's poison. The sound of carriage wheels vanish into silence, footsteps disappear, and neighbors collapse only a few steps from safety. This wasn't a scene from a horror film, it was London, shrouded in a killer fog. For decades, the city's own breath suffocated its people. This is the chilling story of the forgotten London fog, when an invisible enemy turned the world's most powerful city into a death trap.
The phenomenon of the London fog was unlike anything seen in other cities of the 19th and early 20th centuries. It was not a simple weather event, nor merely the byproduct of industrialization. It was a combination of geography, climate, urban growth, and human neglect. To Londoners, it was both familiar and terrifying, a presence that defined their daily lives, marked their winters, and sometimes ended them abruptly. Contemporary accounts describe the fog with a sense of awe and dread. It was not a light mist or passing haze. When it descended, the air became so dense with soot, smoke, and moisture that visibility dropped to only a few feet. A man standing at one side of a narrow street could barely see the opposite curb. Gas lamps, burning throughout the city, glowed as faint yellow orbs against a wall of impenetrable brown. Charles Dickens, writing in the mid-19th century, often used the fog as a symbol of confusion, corruption, and decay. In Bleak House, he described it rolling through the streets, seeping into houses, and clinging to every object and surface. For his readers, this was not metaphor alone. It was a depiction of their daily existence. The fog crept into their clothing, filled their lungs, and left the taste of coal dust in their mouths. One observer in 1873 recalled how the streets vanished entirely in the gloom. Horse-drawn carriages could barely move, their drivers forced to lead the horses on foot. Pedestrians clutched walls, inching along to avoid accidents. Lamps were lit at midday, their weak glow swallowed by the thickness of the air. In homes and businesses, windows were shut tightly, but even so the smoke-laden mist slipped through cracks and under doors. The fog was not always deadly, but it was always oppressive. In the absence of wind, it lingered for days at a time. The longer it stayed, the more suffocating it became. People reported coughing fits, sore throats, and burning eyes. Families with young children or elderly members often prayed for a change in weather, knowing that each hour brought greater risk to the vulnerable. London geography made it especially susceptible. The city lay in a river basin, its damp climate producing natural mists and fogs. But it was a human addition of coal smoke that transformed these natural fogs into lethal pea soupers. Coal was the foundation of life in Victorian and Edwardian London. It heated homes, powered factories, fueled transport, and even lit the city through gasworks. The cost of this reliance was the saturation of the air with soot and sulfur compounds. Visitors to the city were often struck by the sight. French and American travelers wrote with astonishment about the dense, yellow-black pall that settled over London in winter. Some compared it to a permanent eclipse, where daylight hours seemed consumed by twilight. For locals, however, this was simply part of life, expected, endured, and often joked about, even as it claimed lives. The terror of the fog was not confined to its appearance. Its effects on movement and safety were immediate. Traffic accidents became common. Horses stumbled and collided. Wagons overturned. Pedestrians fell into the Thames or were struck by vehicles they never saw coming. In December 1873, newspapers recorded multiple cases of people drowning after walking blindly into canals and docks. In 1880, a mail train failed to see signals through the haze, leading to a deadly collision. The disorientation was profound. People described losing their way within yards of their homes. Landmarks disappeared. The very shape of the city seemed to dissolve. A walk to a corner shop could turn into an ordeal of groping through darkness, lungs burning with every breath. Crime flourished in the cover of fog. Pickpockets, robbers, and even murderers used it as a cloak, knowing witnesses could see nothing. Police patrols reported near impossibility in pursuing suspects when the air itself hid their movements. Accounts from hospitals revealed the strain these fogs caused. Admissions for respiratory illness surged in foggy periods. Doctors noted the overwhelming stench of sulfur and coal tar on patients' clothes and breath. Bronchitis cases multiplied, and the already fragile, the very young, the old, and those with chronic conditions often did not survive. Yet the fog was also strangely normalized. It entered culture and imagination. Painters depicted it in somber tones, and writers made it part of London's identity. Foreigners associated the city with perpetual gloom. Tourists sometimes even sought it out, eager to experience the legendary London fog. What they did not always grasp was that this fog was not a natural wonder, but a man-made hazard. The 1891 fog is remembered as one of the worst of the Victorian era. Lasting for days, it left over 1,000 recorded deaths in its wake. Eyewitnesses spoke of a darkness that made candles necessary at noon, of coughing fits that spread across households, and of a silence broken only by the occasional crash of a cart or the cry of someone who had stumbled in the gloom. Newspapers described the city as choked and strangled. The Times ran editorials questioning how long Londoners would accept such a fate. But little changed. The reliance on coal was too deeply entrenched. Every household stove and every factory chimney added to the problem. When fog returned, as it always did, people endured. They tied handkerchiefs around their faces, carried lanterns, and hoped for wind or rain to clear the air. The phenomenon shaped not only health and safety, but also psychology. The fog fostered a sense of vulnerability, a reminder of human fragility in the face of environment. It blurred the lines between day and night, between familiar and strange. It carried with it the knowledge that each breath might draw in the particles that would weaken the body. Even the sound of the city changed. With visibility gone, voices echoed strangely. Footsteps seemed closer or farther than they were, and the creak of a wheel or the clop of a hoof emerged suddenly from the darkness. London became, in those moments, a city of shadows and whispers. For the poor, the impact was greatest. Their housing, often located in the most polluted districts, trapped the fog indoors. Families living in single rooms with coal stoves had no escape. Their mortality rates reflected this cruel geography. Meanwhile, wealthier citizens, while not immune, could retreat to less affected areas or leave the city altogether during the worst periods. The terror of the London fog was therefore both collective and unequal. It was a shared experience that united the city in confusion, yet divided it in suffering. It symbolized the price of progress, the cost of powering an empire through the lungs of its people. By the mid-20th century, the fogs would reach their most deadly form, but even in the Victorian age, the pattern was set. The city had become accustomed to darkness, to suffocation, and to the unsettling realization that the very air was no longer safe. The London fog did not appear out of nowhere. Its origins were deeply tied to the rise of an industrial empire, one that transformed Britain into the workshop of the world. To understand the fog, one must first understand the coal, the chimneys, and the relentless growth that made London both a marvel of progress and a cauldron of poison. By the dawn of the 19th century, London was the largest city in Europe, and soon it would become the largest in the world. Its population surged from just under 1 million in 1800 to over 6 million by the end of the century. This rapid growth was driven by the Industrial Revolution, which redefined the relationship between humanity, energy, and the environment. Coal was the fuel of this transformation. Britain's abundant coal reserves gave it an advantage unmatched by continental powers. Mines in Wales, Northumberland, and Yorkshire supplied a steady flow of black rock that was shipped into the capital. The Thames became a river of coal barges, unloading endless cargoes at wharves and depots. Mountains of coal were stacked along the docks, waiting to be carted into homes, factories, and gasworks. The reliance on coal extended into every aspect of daily life. In middle-class households, coal fires heated drawing rooms and kitchens. In the slums, families huddled around smoky stoves, burning coal of the lowest quality, often riddled with impurities that produced thick, acrid smoke. For the wealthy, coal consumption was a sign of comfort. For the poor, it was a matter of survival. But whether burned in mansions or tenements, every fire added to the haze over London. Factories multiplied across the city's outskirts, their chimneys forming a forest of brick stacks that spewed black plumes into the air. The skyline, once marked by church steeples and the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral, became increasingly dominated by industrial smokestacks. The smell of sulfur and soot clung to the city. Workers emerging from textile mills or ironworks carried the stench of burning coal on their clothes. The invention of the steam engine, perfected by James Watt in the late 18th century, accelerated the problem. Steam power required immense quantities of coal, and as the technology spread, so too did the emissions. Trains, powered by coal-fired locomotives, chug into London Station surrounded by clouds of smoke. The new railway termini, Paddington, King's Cross, Euston, became funnels of soot, pumping pollutants directly into the city's air. London's gas lighting, introduced in the early 19th century, was another contributor. Gasworks, fueled by coal, produced both illumination and contamination. Residents enjoyed the glow of gas lamps along major streets, but the prize was the foul smoke that poured from the furnaces used to generate that gas. The very innovation that made the city safer at night also darkened its skies during the day. Observers in the 1820s and 1830s were already noting the consequences. The German chemist Justus von Liebig wrote that London's air was filled with a cloud of coal smoke visible miles away. Artists such as J.M.W. Turner captured the hazy skylines, painting sunsets that seemed more dramatic because of the particulate matter that refracted the light. The beauty of these images belied the reality. The haze was toxic, and it was growing thicker with each passing decade. Industrial growth also shaped the physical landscape of London. The River Thames, already burdened by sewage and waste, carried the detritus of factories along its banks. Canals and railway lines sliced through neighborhoods, feeding coal into every district. The city became not just a place of residence, but a machine, an organism whose lifeblood was fossil fuel. Yet despite the obvious signs of pollution, there was little incentive to change. Coal was cheap, reliable, and domestic, a source of energy that secured Britain's independence from foreign imports. It powered the navy that ruled the seas, the factories that produced textiles for global trade, and the printing presses that spread British culture worldwide. Coal was more than fuel. It was national power. The growth of London's population magnified the problem. In crowded districts such as Whitechapel, Bethnal Green, and Southwark, poor ventilation, narrow streets, and high density ensured that smoke lingered longer. Tenements clustered around factories trapped the fog, leaving residents in a perpetual twilight of smoke and soot. Mortality rates in these districts reflected the harshness of the environment. Reports from the Registrar General in the mid-19th century linked high death rates in East London directly to poor air quality and overcrowded living conditions. Parliament occasionally debated the issue of smoke, but regulation was minimal. The 1853 Smoke Nuisance Abatement Act targeted only the worst offenders, and enforcement was weak. The belief that industry was essential to prosperity overshadowed concerns about health. Politicians and industrialists argued that smoke was simply the price of progress. Some even claimed it was a sign of vitality, proof that Britain's engines of commerce were thriving. Contemporary writers captured both the fascination and horror of industrial London. Henry Mayhew, in his London Labour and the London Poor, described the grimy faces and coughing children of working-class districts, all living under a canopy of soot. Foreign visitors often remarked on the striking contrast between the wealth of the West End and the blackened misery of the East. By the 1870s, London's air was among the daintiest in the world. Meteorological studies revealed that the city often had higher levels of suspended particles than any other European capital. The fogs that settled each winter were no longer natural phenomena but man-made disasters, intensified by the endless burning of coal. The city's identity became inseparable from its pollution. The term London particulate emerged, a phrase used half-jokingly to describe the thickest fogs. Artists and authors turned it into a motif, while citizens endured it as an unavoidable feature of urban life. The industrial beast had been unleashed, and its breath was smoke. What made London unique was not just its reliance on coal, but its scale. No other city burned as much, emitted as much, or suffered as much from the consequences. Its very success as a global hub ensured its affliction. The fog was a shadow cast by empire, a darkness created by the same power that fueled Britain's dominance on the world stage. By the close of the 19th century, the connection between industry and air pollution was undeniable, yet little had been done to address it. Londoners continued to breathe the byproducts of progress, living in a city where growth meant suffocation. The industrial beast had transformed the skyline, reshaped daily life, and left its mark on every breath taken within its boundaries. The stage was set for catastrophe, but in the meantime, the fog remained, a silent companion to prosperity, a darkness that would not lift. London in the 19th and early 20th centuries was defined by coal smoke. It clung to every surface, filled every room, and settled in every lung. To grasp the scale of the city's fog problem, one must examine the very composition of the air, the particles, gases, and chemical reactions that transformed ordinary mist into a deadly haze. The fogs that blanketed London were not purely natural. The city's climate, lying in a damp temperate zone along the Thames, naturally produced mist in winter. Cold air trapped moisture close to the ground, and under normal circumstances this would have created a harmless, if inconvenient, fog. But in London, this natural occurrence mixed with pollutant from millions of chimneys, producing a toxic brew. The central culprit was coal, and not just any coal, but a type known as bituminous coal. This variety was cheap, plentiful, and burned with a smoky flame. When ignited in household grates or industrial furnaces, it released vast quantities of soot, ash, and unburned carbon particles. These fine particles, suspended in the air, gave the fog its yellow-brown color and pea-soup consistency. Sulfur compounds were another deadly ingredient. Coal from British mines contained significant amounts of sulfur, which, when burned, produced sulfur dioxide gas. In damp, foggy conditions, this gas combined with water droplets to form sulfurous acid, an irritant to the eyes, nose, and throat. Prolonged exposure inflamed airways, worsened bronchitis, and could prove fatal to the elderly or infirm. Chemists of the time gradually began to identify these processes. By the mid-19th century, researchers such as Robert Angus Smith, later known as the father of acid rain studies, noted that urban air contained chemical mixtures far more dangerous than simple smoke. He measured high levels of sulfur compounds in Manchester and London, linking them to respiratory illness. His work was met with interest but little immediate policy change. Another element was carbon monoxide, an odorless but lethal gas produced by incomplete combustion. Though harder to detect, it was present in significant quantities during dense fogs, contributing to headaches, dizziness, and in severe cases, death. Alongside it were polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, sticky black tars that coated walls, windows, and lungs alike. The sensory experience of London's air was unforgettable. Travelers wrote of its acrid taste, its smell of burning sulfur, and its ability to blacken a white handkerchief in minutes. Clothing required constant brushing. Curtains and walls quickly turned gray. Housewives complained that even freshly laundered garments could never stay clean. The air was a permanent, inescapable contaminant. The effects were visible not only on people but on the city itself. Stone buildings, once bright, became darkened with soot. Monuments eroded faster as acidic compounds ate into limestone and marble. St. Paul's Cathedral, admired for its white Portland stone, gradually turned black under layers of coal dust. The very architecture of the city bore scars of its atmosphere. Medical reports throughout the 19th century confirmed the link between air quality and health. Physicians in East London noted the prevalence of chronic coughs, asthma, and bronchitis among their patients. Hospitals recorded surges in admissions during fog episodes, often coinciding with spikes in mortality. In 1879, one particularly severe fog was followed by over 700 excess deaths within a week. Statistics gathered by the Registrar General's office added further evidence. Mortality tables reveal higher death rates in winter, particularly among infants and the elderly. Analysts connected these seasonal peaks to the fogs, which coincided with cold weather and increased coal burning. The correlation was undeniable, even if causation was still debated. The poor bore the heaviest burden. In cramped tenements, coal fires burned constantly through the winter. Families could only afford the cheapest coal, often rich in impurities. Their chimneys smoked heavily, contributing to both neighborhood pollution and their own indoor air hazards. Windows, if they existed, were rarely open in cold weather, trapping fumes inside. Children raised in these conditions frequently developed chronic respiratory issues before reaching adolescence. Wealthier households also relied on coal, but their larger homes provided better ventilation and cleaner burning supplies. They could retreat to country estates during the worst fogs, escaping the suffocating city. For the working class, there was no escape. The air they breathed, indoors and out, was laden with poison. By the late 19th century, scientific instruments allowed more precise measurement. Observatories in London recorded not only temperature and humidity, but also suspended particulates. The results were stark. During fog events, particle concentrations soared to levels many times higher than in rural areas. These were not ordinary environmental fluctuations, but man-made crises. Public recognition of the problem grew slowly. Newspapers occasionally highlighted the issue, especially after severe fogs that disrupted transport or caused multiple deaths. Yet the political will to regulate fuel or industry was weak. The economic and social dependence on coal outweighed the health concerns. To many, the fogs were simply part of London life, as inevitable as rain. Writers captured the contradiction. To some, the fog had a grim romance, a symbol of mystery and intrigue, a backdrop for crime stories and Gothic fiction. To others, it was a suffocating menace, a reminder of industrial excess. Both perspectives held truth. The fog was atmospheric in art, but it was lethal in reality. Scientific studies of the early 20th century deepened understanding. Researchers observed that during fog events, the concentration of pollutants could be so dense that visibility dropped to less than 5 meters. They linked this to traffic accidents, increased hospital admissions, and elevated death rates. By the 1920s and 1930s, the term smog, a blend of smoke and fog, entered popular vocabulary, emphasizing its human origin. Yet despite mounting evidence, coal remained dominant. Britain's economy depended on it, and millions of households relied on its cheap heat. Efforts to introduce cleaner fuels, such as coal gas, were limited by cost and infrastructure. Until the mid-20th century, the majority of Londoners still lit their fires with the same smoky coal that had blackened their city for over a century. The air Londoners breathed was thus a paradox, essential to life, yet infused with substances that shortened that life. Every breath carried particles of soot and acid. Every lungful wore down the body. The fog was not an occasional intruder, but a constant presence, its intensity varying but its influence unending. The composition of the London fog illustrates a collision between natural climate and human industry. Mist alone could not kill thousands. Smoke alone might dissipate in dry weather. But together, in the damp basin of the Thames Valley, they created a killer that Londoners could neither see through nor escape. The city lived under a permanent pull, each winter a reminder that progress had come at the price of poisoned air. By the time the world would witness the catastrophic fog of 1952, the ingredients were already well understood. The chemistry had been measured, the health effects documented, the social cost debated. Yet the reliance on coal kept the cycle unbroken. For more than a century, Londoners breathed an atmosphere thick with a residue of their own prosperity. The air of London was both its lifeblood and its poison. It carried the smoke of empire, the fuel of factories, and the warmth of homes. But it also carried soot into lungs, acid into stone, and death into households. The story of the London fog was, at its core, the story of the air itself, transformed by human hands into something both vital and fatal. The London fog was not merely an inconvenience. It was a direct threat to life and safety, claiming victims in ways both immediate and insidious. While its long-term health consequences were profound, its short-term dangers were equally terrifying. For those caught in its grip, the fog turned ordinary streets into corridors of death. From the earliest industrial fogs of the 19th century, reports of fatalities were common. The dense air reduced visibility to almost nothing. Carriages collided, pedestrians stumbled into unseen hazards, and entire neighborhoods ground to a halt. The fog was thick enough to be described as touchable, a substance rather than an atmosphere. Within it, danger lurked at every step. Newspaper accounts of the Victorian era documented the toll. In December 1873, a particularly severe fog caused chaos across the city. Carters and cab drivers abandoned their vehicles, unable to see the road ahead. Horses, disoriented and frightened, reared or stumbled into ditches. Several deaths were recorded as pedestrians walked directly into the Thames or fell into the canals. At least one barge crew reported hearing a man's cries in the water, but being unable to locate him through the impenetrable gloom. Even in ordinary fogs, traffic accidents surged. London streets, crowded with omnibuses, carts, and cabs, became deadly zones. The rattle of wheels and the shouts of drivers were muffled in the haze, leaving little warning of an oncoming vehicle. Injuries and fatalities from collisions were so frequent that police issued special warnings whenever fog descended. By the 1890s, hospitals were accustomed to admitting a wave of accident victims whenever visibility collapsed. The fog disrupted not only road traffic but railways as well. Signals became invisible to train drivers, leading to disasters. In December 1876, Near the Kentish town station, a mail train collided with another because its driver could not see the signal through the fog. 12 people died, and dozens were injured. The accident underscored the lethal combination of industrial growth and natural weather, amplified by human dependence on coal. For the average Londoner, the fog created a constant sense of peril. People described losing their way within a few yards of their homes. Stories circulated of children separated from parents in the haze, their cries echoing in the gloom as frantic families searched blindly. Elderly residents often collapsed on the streets, unable to find their way or struggling to breathe in the acrid air. The psychological toll was equally severe. The fog inspired fear and confusion, heightening the sense that the city itself had become hostile. It stripped away orientation, landmarks, and familiar comforts. Gas lamps, normally reliable guides, appeared only as faint halos swallowed by darkness. Shopkeepers reported customers walking past their doors without realizing they had arrived. For many, the fog felt like an invasion, a smothering blanket that stole not only sight but also security. Crime thrived in these conditions. Reports from the Metropolitan Police noted spikes in robberies during dense fogs. Thieves took advantage of the near invisibility, ambushing victims who could neither see nor identify their attackers. Pickpockets worked with impunity, knowing that witnesses would be unable to describe them. In some notorious cases, even murder was concealed by the fog. The infamous Jack the Ripper killings of 1888 were not directly linked to fog events, but the atmosphere of East London's mist-shrouded alleys became inseparable from the terror of those crimes. The fog's victims were not only those who stumbled or were struck down, but also those who succumbed quietly to suffocation. Hospitals recorded surges in admissions during prolonged fogs, particularly among the elderly and infants. Doctors reported patients arriving with labored breathing, their lungs filled with soot and irritation from sulfurous gases. Mortality data revealed spikes of hundreds, sometimes thousands, during extended fogs. In the 1891 fog, one of the worst of the Victorian period, mortality rose dramatically. Over 1,000 excess deaths were reported in just a few days. Newspapers published grim statistics alongside accounts of funerals overwhelmed by the sheer number of coffins. The Registrar General acknowledged that the air itself had become lethal, though solutions remained elusive. For workers required to navigate the streets, the fog was an occupational hazard. Policemen, lamplighters, and drivers risked injury or death each time the city was blanketed. Lamplighters, tasked with igniting gas lamps, sometimes failed to find their posts at all. Policemen patrolling in pairs often lost one another within minutes. Drivers of omnibuses or hansom cabs described leading their horses on foot, lanterns in hand, hoping to avoid collisions. Even so, accidents were frequent. The scale of disruption extended to commerce and public life. Deliveries halted, markets emptied, and shops closed. Courts adjourned sessions when witnesses failed to appear, lost in the haze. Schools sent children home early, fearing accidents on the walk back. Factories reported reduced output as workers arrived late or not at all. The city, normally alive with noise and movement, fell into eerie silence whenever a major fog settled. Eyewitnesses left vivid descriptions. One account in the Illustrated London News described men groping their way along the Strand with arms outstretched, bumping into strangers, walls, and horses alike. Another witness wrote of hearing the cry of a woman struck by a cab but being unable to locate her until others stumbled upon the scene. The fog transformed familiar boulevards into labyrinths of danger. The deaths caused by fog were not always immediate. Many victims returned home only to fall ill within days. The inhalation of soot and sulfur aggravated existing conditions, leading to bronchitis, pneumonia, and heart failure. For the poor, unable to afford medical care, these illnesses were often fatal. In this way, the fog claimed lives indirectly, its toll hidden in the statistics of respiratory disease. Animals also suffered. Horses collapsed in the streets, unable to breathe the heavy air. Birds were reported falling dead from rooftops. In some cases, cattle brought into the city for market suffocated before reaching pens. These deaths further alarmed the public, underscoring the unnatural toxicity of the fog. The city adapted in small ways. Torches, lanterns, and even flaming torches carried by footmen became common during fog events. Some shopkeepers installed brighter gas lamps to lure customers. Policemen used whistles and shouted constantly to alert travelers to hazards. But no adaptation could fully counteract the danger. The fog was too dense, too unpredictable, and too deadly. For decades, Londoners lived with this reality. Winter after winter, fogs descended, and with them came injury, fear, and death. Each episode revealed the fragility of life in an industrial city. Each funeral procession through smoke-darkened streets reminded citizens that progress carried a terrible cost. The phrase "death in the streets" was not an exaggeration but a lived reality. The fog transformed the city into a trap, claiming victims openly and silently, whether through accidents in the gloom or the slow choking of poisoned lungs. Londoners knew that survival in these conditions required luck as much as caution. The darkness that settled over the city was more than a meteorological event. It was a physical manifestation of industrial ambition and neglect, a reminder that the very fuel that powered Britain's greatness also turned its capital into a graveyard. By December of 1952, Londoners were no strangers to fog. For over a century, they had endured pea soupers, thick brown-yellow clouds of smoke and mist that suffocated the city each winter. People joked about them, cursed them, and endured them. But nothing prepared the capital for what came in the winter of 1952. The Great Smog was unlike anything before, a convergence of weather and pollution that turned the city into a tomb. It began innocuously on Friday, December 5th. Temperatures dropped sharply across southern England, and a high-pressure system settled over the Thames Valley. This weather pattern created what meteorologists call a temperature inversion. A layer of warm air high above the city trapped the cold air beneath it, preventing smoke and fumes from dispersing upward. The natural mist of the Thames basin thickened. At the same time, Londoners lit their fires. The cold snap drove households to burn coal around the clock. But after years of economic strain following the Second World War, most families had access only to cheap, low-grade coal, nutty slack, as it was called, a fuel high in sulfur and ash. Factories, power plants, and buses joined in, pumping out exhaust into an atmosphere with nowhere to go. By the evening of December 5th, the fog began to thicken beyond the ordinary. At first, it seemed familiar. Visibility was poor, the air smelled acrid, and lamps glowed faintly in the haze. But by Saturday, December 6th, it had become clear that this was something different. The smog grew denser, darker, and more suffocating with each hour. Visibility dropped to a few feet. Drivers abandoned their cars in the streets. Buses and trains ceased to run. Flights at Heathrow and other airfields were cancelled. Even ambulances gave up. Patients were carried on foot through the gloom because vehicles could not navigate the streets. Reports emerged of buses creeping along only when a conductor walked in front of them with a lantern. By Sunday, December 7th, the smog had become lethal. Hospitals filled with patients struggling to breathe. Doctors reported a flood of admissions for respiratory distress, with many already in critical condition. Those with chronic bronchitis, asthma, or heart disease were hit hardest. Nurses described patients gasping for air, their lips turning blue, as lungs filled with fluid. Inside homes, conditions were little better. The smog infiltrated buildings, seeping through cracks and under doors. Residents reported being unable to see across their own living rooms. Curtains and furniture became stained with soot. Families huddled indoors with damp claws pressed against their faces, but nothing kept the poisonous air at bay. The effects were immediate and devastating. Livestock in Smithfield Market died in their pens. Horses collapsed in the streets. Bus conductors reported seeing passengers slump in their seats, overcome by the fumes. The smog was not simply unpleasant. It was toxic, a cocktail of sulfur dioxide, hydrochloric acid, and soot particles in concentrations far beyond safe limits. Eyewitnesses recalled surreal scenes. One man described being unable to find his way home from just 2 streets away, stumbling blindly until a passerby guided him. A woman in Stepney reported hearing the cries of a child, but being unable to locate them in the darkness. Trains stood idle at stations, their drivers unwilling to risk collisions. London became a silent, suffocating city, its millions of residents trapped in place. By Monday, December 8th, the death toll began to mount visibly. Morgues overflowed. Hospitals ran out of oxygen supplies and struggled to treat the sheer number of patients. Doctors later estimated that in those days, the mortality rate was 10 times higher than average. Funeral homes reported queues of coffins waiting for burial. The city's undertakers could not keep pace. The fog persisted for 5 days, only beginning to lift on Tuesday, December 9th, when a breeze finally dispersed the trapped pollution. By then, the scale of the disaster had become undeniable. Initial estimates suggested around 4,000 deaths, but later research pushed the number much higher. Epidemiological studies concluded that as many as 12,000 people died as a direct result of the smog, with tens of thousands more suffering long-term illness. The Great Smog was not the first deadly fog in London's history, but it was the most catastrophic. Its suddenness, its scale, and its human toll shocked the nation. For decades, fog had been dismissed as an unavoidable nuisance, part of the fabric of London life. Now it was recognized as a public health emergency. In Parliament, the disaster forced a reckoning. Questions were raised about coal policy, industrial emissions, and the role of government in protecting citizens from environmental hazards. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, though initially reluctant to acknowledge the scale of the tragedy, faced growing pressure as mortality figures became public. The aftermath also marked a turning point in scientific understanding. Researchers studied the chemistry of the smog, analyzing hospital records and atmospheric data. They confirmed that the lethal cocktail of sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and particulates had been intensified by weather conditions. This was no ordinary fog. It was a man-made disaster, the result of decades of unchecked coal burning. For ordinary Londoners, the memory of those days remained vivid. Survivors spoke of the taste of sulfur in every breath, the eerie silence of a city brought to a halt, and the funerals that followed in its wake. Families mourned loved ones lost without warning, while children remembered the suffocating darkness that seemed to swallow the world. The tragedy finally spurred meaningful reform. The Clean Air Act of 1956, introduced 4 years later, was a direct response to the disaster. It regulated domestic coal burning, introduced smokeless zones, and encouraged a shift toward cleaner fuels such as gas and electricity. Though the problem of air pollution did not vanish overnight, the Great Smog marked the end of London's acceptance of deadly fogs as normal. In retrospect, the Great Fog of 1952 was both a disaster and a turning point. It revealed the hidden costs of industrial progress and forced Britain to confront the consequences of its reliance on coal. The deaths of thousands in just a few days became a catalyst for environmental awareness, reshaping policy and public consciousness alike. For centuries, London's fog had been a symbol of mystery, romance, or menace. After 1952, it became something else entirely, a warning, a reminder that the very air we breathe can be transformed by human actions into a force of destruction. The Great Smog was a culmination of a century's neglect, but it was also the beginning of change. Out of its suffocating darkness emerged the first real steps toward environmental protection, not just in Britain but across the modern world. The Great Smog of 1952 revealed in stark, immediate terms that London's air could kill. But the truth was that it had been doing so long before that December disaster, and long after. The fogs were not only dramatic events that choked the city for a few days. They were part of a chronic, invisible threat that lingered in every breath. London's fog was the most visible face of a deeper problem, the slow violence of air pollution. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, doctors noted patterns that could not be ignored. When fog descended, admissions to hospitals surged. When the haze lifted, the numbers fell again. Death certificates listed bronchitis, pneumonia, heart failure, or natural causes. But beneath those official terms lay a consistent culprit: poisoned air. Respiratory disease was endemic in London. By the mid-1800s, bronchitis had become one of the leading causes of death in the city. It was not confined to the elderly. Men and women in their 40s and 50s succumbed with alarming frequency. Children developed chronic coughs and inflamed lungs before reaching adolescence. The link between coal smoke and illness was widely observed, if not always officially acknowledged. Medical journals of the period provide chilling detail. Physicians describe patients whose lungs were coated with blackened mucus, whose breathing rattled with each intake of air. Autopsies revealed soot particles lodged deep in lung tissue, staining them gray and black. Doctors noted that even those who had never worked in factories carried the marks of industrial exposure simply from living in the city. The silent killers extended beyond the lungs. Cardiovascular disease, though less understood at the time, was also exacerbated by pollution. Studies conducted after the Great Smog demonstrated that sulfur dioxide and particulates triggered heart attacks and strokes. Retrospective analysis of death records suggested that thousands of lives lost in earlier fogs had likely been due to cardiac failure, misattributed at the time. For the poor, the impact was relentless. Families living in East End slums had little choice but to burn low-grade coal constantly in winter. Their children coughed through the night, their elders wheezed through the day. Mortality rates in these districts were far higher than in the wealthier West End, where cleaner fuels and better housing offered some protection. The fog was democratic in appearance, but not in effect. It struck hardest where poverty already weighed heaviest. The chronic nature of exposure meant that even outside the worst fog events, Londoners lived with a baseline level of danger. On clear days, the air still carried soot, tar, and sulfur. Windowsill collected dust in hours, and the sky often hung with a permanent haze. The city's mortality rate, consistently higher than rural areas, reflected this constant background pollution. Doctors tried to sound the alarm. In the 1870s, George Birdwood, a medical officer of health, warned that the city's atmosphere was slowly killing its inhabitants. By the early 20th century, statistical studies confirmed that death rates in London spiked during fog episodes, but remained elevated year-round compared to cleaner towns. The evidence was strong, but change was slow. Industry, economy, and habit outweighed public health concerns. Beyond the body, the fog damaged the mind. Contemporary observers noted the psychological toll of living under a pall of smoke. Depression, anxiety, and a sense of hopelessness were common in districts where the sun rarely pierced the haze. Children grew up thinking it normal that daylight was dim, that coughing was constant, that the smell of sulfur marked every breath. The fog's silent toll was not confined to London. Other industrial cities across Britain, Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, Glasgow, suffered similar problems. But London, with its immense population and geographic position, was the epicenter. Its mortality statistics became the most striking evidence of what unchecked coal burning could do to a population. One particularly revealing episode occurred during the winter of 1948 in Donora, Pennsylvania, in the United States. A similar smog event killed dozens and sickened thousands in a small steel town. When British scientists examined the Donora disaster, they saw confirmation of what they already suspected, that coal smoke and industrial fumes were not nuisances but killers. Yet it took the catastrophe of 1952 to make the lesson undeniable in Britain. The term smog entered everyday language in the early 20th century, reflecting the recognition that fog and smoke had fused into something new. By then, Londoners were beginning to understand that the fogs were not natural phenomena at all, but man-made hazards. Still, cultural portrayals continued to romanticize the misty streets, even as the medical community described the damage they inflicted. Statistical research conducted in the aftermath of the Great Smog provided the most damning proof. Mortality figures showed that in the first week alone, around 4,000 more people died than expected. Over the following months, the number rose to an estimated 12,000. Most of these deaths were not sudden accidents in the street, but quiet suffocations in homes and hospitals. The silent killers did their work out of sight, claiming victims through inflamed lungs, infected airways, and overburdened hearts. Long-term studies revealed even greater consequences. Those exposed to repeated fogs suffered reduced life expectancy. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, lung cancer, and cardiovascular illness all showed higher incidence among Londoners than among rural populations. The city's industrial air had effectively shortened the lives of generations. The recognition of this chronic burden reshaped medical science. Public health officials began to treat air pollution as a disease vector, as dangerous as contaminated water or poor sanitation. The lesson of cholera in the 19th century, that invisible forces in the environment could devastate a population, was now being applied to the very air itself. By the 1960s, cleaner air legislation began to reduce the frequency of deadly fogs. But the memory of those silent killers lingered. Families remembered loved ones who had died of the fog, even when official records listed other causes. Doctors carried the scars of overcrowded wards and patients gasping for breath. The smog became part of collective memory, not as an occasional nuisance, but as a predator that had stalked the city for over a century. In the end, the silent killers of the London fog remind us that danger does not always arrive with noise and spectacle. Sometimes it comes quietly, seeping into lungs and homes, eroding life day by day. The pea soupers may be gone, but their legacy lives on in medical research, in environmental policy, and in the blackened lungs preserved in pathology archives, silent testimony to an age when the air itself turned against its people. The fogs of London left an indelible mark on those who lived through them. Beyond statistics and scientific reports, the most powerful testimony comes from the voices of ordinary people, men, women, and children who found themselves trapped in a city where the air turned into a shroud. Their words capture the fear, confusion, and resignation of a population that endured what later generations could scarcely imagine. Newspapers of the Victorian era often printed first-hand accounts during fog episodes. The Illustrated London News in 1873 described the scene on the Strand. Men groped their way with arms outstretched, clinging to walls or strangers alike. Drivers abandoned their horses, unable to discern the road beneath their feet. Gas lamps glowed like sickly moons in a sea of darkness, swallowed at a distance of mere yards. Such descriptions were not exaggerations. Travelers arriving in the city consistently reported the same conditions. An American visitor in 1880 wrote home, "The very sun is extinguished. Noon resembles midnight. The air bites the throat and stings the eyes, yet the people stumble on as though this were nothing new." Diaries provide even more intimate glimpses. A clerk named Henry Crabb Robinson recorded in December 1813, "The fog is dreadful. I could not see the opposite side of the street. The smoke mixes with the mist, and the smell of coal is everywhere. Many lost their way entirely. The air was suffocating, my lungs oppressed. I reached home by God's grace." Such personal entries reflect the disorientation that defined these events. People found themselves trapped in familiar streets that suddenly became unrecognizable. Landmarks disappeared. Even one's own doorstep might vanish into the haze. The language of the time reveals how Londoners struggled to describe the phenomenon. Words like black, yellow, suffocating, and poisonous recur in letters and reports. The fog was not merely weather, it was a tangible intruder. In December 1891, the Times published letters from readers describing the horror. I ventured out at 9 o'clock, but returned in despair. One could not see a yard ahead. I heard the cries of a woman struck down by a cart, but could not find her. Only when others stumbled upon her body was she lifted to safety. The driver claimed he never saw her until too late. These testimonies carried a tone of resignation as well as alarm. Londoners knew the fog would come each winter, and though each episode brought chaos, there was little they could do but endure. The words of doctors add another layer of testimony. Sir William Farr, a physician and statistician, wrote in 1852 of a fog episode, "The mortality of London has suddenly doubled. The deaths are chiefly among infants, the elderly, and those weakened by prior illness. The fog was charged with soot, smoke, and sulphurous acid. The lungs of the people became the filters of the city." Such stark language highlighted the human cost hidden in mortality tables. Doctors on the ground saw the victims firsthand, their lungs overwhelmed by the very air they depended on. In the 20th century, voices became more urgent. During the Great Smog of 1952, eyewitnesses filled newspapers and radio broadcasts with accounts of terror. One bus conductor described leading his vehicle through the streets. "I walked before the bus with a lantern. The driver followed my light as best he could. At times, I could not see my own feet. Passengers inside coughed and gagged. We advanced only a few yards at a time, before halting again." Another survivor, a nurse at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, recalled, "The wards filled beyond capacity. People came in gasping, their faces gray, their lips blue. We had no more oxygen to give. Some died in the corridors before a bed could be found." For ordinary families, the experience was deeply personal. Letters preserved in archives described children coughing through the night, mothers praying for wind, fathers guiding relatives step by step through streets that vanished into brown darkness. One woman wrote after 1952, "I could not see my baby's cot though it stood by my bed. The air was thick indoors as well as out. We stuffed towels under the doors, but the fog came through the walls themselves." Animals, too, became witnesses of a kind. Reports spoke of cattle collapsing in Smithfield Market, their bodies covered with soot. Birds fell from the sky, disoriented and suffocated. Horses, long the lifeblood of London's traffic, stumbled blindly and died in the streets. Their handlers described the horror of animals refusing to move, trembling in confusion. Even art and literature echoed these testimonies. Dickens, Doyle, and later writers used fog not only as atmosphere but as a reflection of lived reality. The fog was both a setting and a character, unpredictable, menacing, suffocating. Their works resonated precisely because their readers knew the fog firsthand. The testimony of foreign observers provides a contrast. Visitors were often shocked by conditions that Londoners accepted as normal. A French journalist in 1902 wrote, "One breath and my throat burned, 1 hour and my lungs ached. Yet the citizens seemed resigned. They walked blind into the cloud as though it were a passing drizzle." To outsiders, the fog was an unnatural calamity. To residents, it was part of life. The persistence of these accounts across decades highlights how deeply fog shaped memory. Generations grew up with stories of relatives lost in the haze, of funerals delayed by fog-bound hearses, of businesses shuttered until the air cleared. These memories were passed down like tales of war or famine, part of the collective identity of the city. After the Great Smog, testimonies took on a sharper tone. Survivors spoke of the fear that lingered long after the air cleared. Families who lost loved ones carried the trauma for years. Nurses and doctors who worked in overwhelmed hospitals recalled the helplessness of watching patients suffocate. Their voices became part of the campaign that demanded reform. In parliamentary debates leading to the Clean Air Act, testimony from doctors and citizens carried as much weight as statistics. Politicians quoted letters from constituents describing nights spent unable to breathe, children who died in their beds, streets where neighbors collapsed unseen. These human voices transformed numbers into urgent call for change. What makes these accounts so powerful is their consistency. Across class, occupation, and era, the descriptions share the same elements: blindness, suffocation, fear, and helplessness. They reveal not only the physical reality of the fog, but its psychological grip on a city that lived in its shadow. Through these voices, the fog of London becomes more than a historical fact. It becomes an experience, lived and remembered. The testimony of those who endured it ensures that we cannot dismiss it as merely a quirk of weather or a backdrop for novels. It was, for them, a daily threat and a source of lasting trauma. The fog's victims included not only the dead but the living, who carried its memory in their lungs, their diaries, and their nightmares. Their voices, preserved in newspapers, letters, and oral histories, remain the most vivid reminder of a time when the air itself turned against the people who breathed it. For more than a century, London lived beneath its fogs, yet little was done to confront the crisis. The air was poisoned, the evidence undeniable, but progress was paralyzed by blame-shifting and denial. Industrialists pointed fingers at nature, politicians hesitated to disrupt the coal economy, and citizens themselves accepted suffering as the cost of modern life. The story of London fog is not only about the smog itself, it is about the failure to act. From the early 19th century, scientists and physicians raised alarms. Medical officers of health linked bronchitis and pneumonia to pollution. Chemists documented sulfur compounds in the air. Mortality statistics spiked after every fog. Yet official responses were hesitant, fragmented, and often dismissive. The fog, authorities insisted, was a meteorological inconvenience, not a man-made killer. The framing of the problem was deliberate. Industry leaders defended coal as a foundation of Britain's global power. Smoke, they argued, was not a nuisance but a sign of prosperity. Where there's muck, there's brass, went a popular phrase, meaning where there is smoke, there is wealth. The sight of factory chimneys belching soot was framed as proof of economic strength. To question it was to question the empire itself. Government inquiries into air pollution surfaced periodically, often after particularly severe fogs. In 1813, after one of the earliest recorded black fogs, doctors urged reform. In 1842, Edwin Chadwick's landmark report on the sanitary condition of the laboring population highlighted environmental factors in disease. Later, in the 1850s and 1860s, the issue reached Parliament in the form of the Smoke Nuisance Abatement Acts. But these measures targeted only the worst industrial offenders and were rarely enforced. Domestic coal use, the largest contributor, remained untouched. The excuse of inevitability was pervasive. Politicians argued that fogs were a natural feature of London's climate, worsened perhaps by smoke, but ultimately beyond human control. This narrative reassured citizens who preferred to believe they were enduring an unavoidable inconvenience rather than suffering from deliberate neglect. The press, too, often played both sides. While newspapers printed dramatic accounts of disoriented pedestrians in crowded morgues, editorials frequently echoed the government's cautious tone. Calls for reform were muted by fears of economic disruption. Coal was Britain's lifeblood, and to regulate it seemed unthinkable. Citizens themselves sometimes internalized this denial. Many joked about fogs, treating them as quirky features of London life. Tourists were sold postcards of mist-shrouded bridges. Painters and authors turned the fog into a romantic backdrop for mystery and drama. The lethal reality, thousands dying quietly in their homes, was overshadowed by the cultural fascination with the London particular. When blame was assigned, it was often misplaced. Factories and railways were condemned for visible smoke, yet household stoves accounted for far more pollution. Power stations and gasworks were easy targets, but millions of fireplaces burning low-grade coal each day produced a majority of soot and sulfur. The problem was systemic, but tackling it required confronting the very structure of urban life. During the Great Smog of 1952, denial reached its most shocking form. As bodies piled up, government officials hesitated to acknowledge the scale of the disaster. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, himself a lifelong supporter of coal, reportedly downplayed the crisis. In Parliament, he resisted calls for urgent intervention, framing the event as an unfortunate coincidence of weather and smoke. For weeks after the smog lifted, official estimates put the death toll at around 4,000. Only later, through epidemiological research, did the true figure emerge, closer to 12,000 dead, with over 100,000 left ill. This gap between reality and admission reflected a pattern. Authorities consistently minimized a crisis to avoid political fallout. Industrial lobbies also wielded significant influence. Coal was not only a fuel but a powerful political interest. Britain's economy, transport, and workforce depended on it. The National Coal Board, established after the industry's nationalization in 1947, was tasked with promoting coal use, not restricting it. To admit that coal was killing thousands was to admit a failure of policy and governance. Scientific voices struggled to break through the denial. Researchers like Robert Angus Smith and later Harold Desvos, who coined the term smog in 1905, provided data linking air pollution to health crises. But their findings were often ignored or dismissed as theoretical. Politicians argued that more research was needed, a familiar tactic for delaying action. Even within the medical community, divisions persisted. Some doctors acknowledged the dangers of smoke, while others attributed deaths to natural winter ailments. Without clear consensus, reform stalled. The fog continued to be framed as a weather problem, not an environmental or industrial one. Public memory was also short. After each major fog lifted, daily life resumed. The urgency faded, funerals passed, and citizens returned to their stoves and chimneys. The city's rhythm of endurance perpetuated the cycle. Only the very poor, who suffered disproportionately, continued to live daily with the consequences, but their voices carried little weight in political debates. The culture of denial persisted because it served everyone in power. Politicians avoided costly reforms. Industrialists protected profits. Citizens maintained the illusion that the fog was inevitable. The victims, meanwhile, were buried quietly, their deaths disguised in statistics. It took the unprecedented scale of the 1952 disaster to shatter this cycle. The silence of morgues overflowing, the sight of coffins lined up in streets, the sheer number of deaths could no longer be ignored. Yet even then, reform came slowly, with the Clean Air Act only passed in 1956 after prolonged debate and lobbying. Blame and denial had cost lives for over a century. They allowed a killer to walk openly in the streets year after year without being named. The story of London's fog is therefore not just about environmental catastrophe, but about the human tendency to look away from uncomfortable truths when they threaten economic or political power. The fog was not inevitable. It was not merely natural. It was the product of choices to burn coal without restraint, to protect industry at the expense of health, to dismiss evidence until the cost became unbearable. Its victims were not only those who died gasping for breath, but those silenced by denial. The London fog was not only a test for the people who endured it, but also for the scientists and doctors who sought to understand it. For over a century, evidence of its dangers accumulated slowly, piece by piece. Yet progress was hampered by uncertainty, skepticism, and the weight of political and economic resistance. The struggle to prove that fog could kill, and to convince society to act, was as long and difficult as the smogs themselves. The earliest observers were doctors on the front lines. In the 1810s and 1820s, physicians noted surges in bronchitis and pneumonia during fog episodes. Mortality tables showed spikes in deaths in weeks when the air turned dark, but medicine at the time lacked the tools to measure causation. Doctors could only describe what they saw: patients coughing up blackened mucus, lungs inflamed, breath shortened. The fog was implicated, but its exact role remained elusive. By mid-century, statistics began to sharpen the picture. Sir William Farr, working for the Registrar General's office, was one of the first to link mortality directly to air quality. In 1852, he published reports showing that death rates in London doubled during severe fogs. He described the air as charged with soot, smoke, and sulfurous acid, making the lungs of the population serve as filters for the city's pollution. Farr's work was groundbreaking, but policymakers treated it as observational rather than actionable. Chemists also began to probe the fog's composition. Robert Angus Smith, a Scottish scientist, devoted much of his career to studying urban air. In the 1850s, he detected high levels of sulfur compounds in Manchester and London, linking them to acid rain and respiratory disease. He coined the term acid rain to describe precipitation contaminated by sulfur dioxide. Though his focus was not solely London, his findings laid the foundation for understanding the chemistry of fog. Smith's work, however, met with resistance. Industrialists dismissed his warnings as exaggerated. Some scientists, reluctant to draw bold conclusions from limited data, urged caution. In the absence of clear chemical explanations, many in government continued to treat fogs as weather events, nuisances rather than killers. The turn of the 20th century brought new voices. In 1905, Dr. Harold Desvos, working for the Coal Smoke Abatement Society, formally coined the word smog to describe the mixture of smoke and fog. He presented data to the Manchester Conference of Public Health Officials, showing that foggy conditions combined with smoke led to mortality increases. The term caught on, and with it came greater recognition that the phenomenon was man-made. Still, change was slow. Smog was acknowledged as unpleasant, but its lethal nature was still debated. Many deaths were attributed to influenza, pneumonia, or natural winter causes. Without modern epidemiology, it was difficult to isolate pollution as a decisive factor. Scientists lacked today's understanding of fine particulates and long-term exposure. The interwar years brought renewed efforts. Studies by the Ministry of Health in the 1920s confirmed that mortality spiked during fogs. Doctors began to speak more openly of a causal link between smog and bronchitis. Yet political inertia persisted. Coal remained the backbone of the nation's energy supply, and evidence that it was killing thousands each winter was inconvenient. During this period, international events underscored the urgency. In 1930, the Maes Valley in Belgium suffered a smog disaster that killed over 60 people in just a few days. 18 years later, in 1948, Donora, Pennsylvania, experienced a similar catastrophe, with 20 dead and thousands hospitalized. British scientists studied these episodes closely, recognizing their similarity to London conditions. But still, little was done at home. When the Great Smog of 1952 struck, science was thrust into the center of public debate. Doctors on the ground described wards overflowing with patients, oxygen supplies exhausted, and death rates soaring. Epidemiologists, working with mortality data, soon confirmed that thousands had died in a matter of days. Researchers identified the chemistry: sulfur dioxide and smoke particles trapped by temperature inversion, creating a toxic cloud. The numbers spoke loudly. Initial government figures estimated 4,000 deaths. Later studies, using modern statistical techniques, revised the toll to at least 12,000. Tens of thousands more suffered long-term illness. For the first time, the scale was undeniable, and scientific voices could not be ignored. One of the most influential studies came from the Medical Research Council in 1954, which analyzed hospital records and mortality data from the Great Smog. It concluded definitively that air pollution was a cause of excess deaths. The report emphasized that these were not isolated cases but part of a larger pattern of chronic harm. The findings made their way into parliamentary debates, giving scientific authority to calls for reform. The passage of the Clean Air Act in 1956 was a culmination of this long scientific struggle. It mandated smokeless zones, promoted cleaner fuels, and restricted the burning of raw coal. While political will and public outrage played decisive roles, it was a persistence of scientists and doctors across decades of resistance that made reform possible. The struggle, however, was not merely technical. It was cultural. Scientists had to battle entrenched beliefs that fog was natural, that smoke was the price of progress, that economic power outweighed health. They had to persuade not only governments but ordinary citizens, who for generations had lived and died in the fog without realizing its full cost. The legacy of this struggle extends beyond London. The science of smog laid the foundation for modern environmental health. Concepts such as particulate matter, acid rain, and air quality indices grew out of the work of those 19th and 20th century pioneers. Their persistence turned anecdote into data, suspicion into proof, and resignation into action. London scientists were often ignored, sometimes ridiculed, but ultimately vindicated. Their story is one of determination against denial, of evidence against habit. They gave voice to the lungs of the city, proving that what people breathed could destroy them. And though reform came late, it came because science refused to be silenced. For generations, London's fog was more than an environmental condition. It became a cultural symbol. Artists, writers, and travelers wove it into the city's identity, portraying it as mysterious, romantic, sinister, and uniquely London. In paintings, novels, and the popular imagination, the fog was everywhere. Yet behind these images lay a tension. While culture turned fog into metaphor, reality made it a public health disaster. The earliest depictions of London fog appeared in the 19th century, as industrial smoke began to blend with natural mist. Writers like Charles Dickens captured it vividly. In Bleak House, 1852-53, Dickens opened with one of the most famous literary descriptions of fog in English literature. Fog everywhere. Fog up the river. Fog down the river, where it rolls defiled among the tears of shipping and the waterside pollutions of a great city. Fog on the Essex marshes. Fog on the Kentish heights. For Dickens, fog was more than atmosphere. It symbolized confusion, corruption, and moral decay. His readers immediately recognized it, because they experienced the same suffocating gloom in their daily lives. Dickens turned environmental misery into metaphor, embedding smog in the very language of Victorian society. Other writers followed. Arthur Conan Doyle, in the Sherlock Holmes stories, repeatedly set scenes against foggy London streets. In The Adventure of the Bruce Partington Plans, 1908, Doyle wrote of a dense yellow fog that concealed every movement, creating the perfect cover for crime. Holmes himself seemed inseparable from the fog. The detective's silhouette, pipe in hand, became iconic against a backdrop of swirling haze. The cultural association between fog and crime was strong. The darkness provided cover for pickpockets, burglars, and murderers. Journalists and novelists alike linked the pea soupers to danger lurking in the shadows. For readers abroad, the fog reinforced an image of London as exotic and sinister, a place where mystery thrived in the gloom. Painters also seized upon the visual drama of smog. J.M.W. Turner, though working early in the century, captured hazy, smoke-filled skies in his later works, reflecting the industrial atmosphere that enveloped the Thames. Later, the French impressionist Claude Monet painted a famous series of canvases in London between 1899 and 1904, stationed at the Savoy Hotel and the Houses of Parliament. Monet depicted the Thames in Westminster shrouded in colored mist. He described his fascination in letters. Without fog, London would not be beautiful. Monet's paintings transformed pollution into art. His canvases of bridges and Parliament buildings glowing through golden haze became celebrated worldwide. Yet what was beautiful to an artist's eye was deadly to the lungs of Londoners below. His works immortalized smog as aesthetic, even as it silently claimed lives. Cultural portrayals extended to theater and popular entertainment. Music halls staged comic songs about losing one's way in the fog. Postcards and tourist souvenirs presented misty images of Big Ben, Tower Bridge, and hansom cabs disappearing into the haze. For visitors, fog became part of London's brand. as recognizable as Buckingham Palace or the Thames. The cinema of the early 20th century cemented these associations. Silent films and later black and white thrillers often used London fog as a backdrop for suspense. The 1939 film The Hound of the Baskervilles, though set in Devon, drew upon the visual language of London fog in its marketing. In popular imagination, fog meant danger, secrecy, and suspense. Abroad, the image of fog became synonymous with London itself. American newspapers referred to London particular fogs as if they were a tourist attraction. Guidebooks warned visitors of the inconvenience but also romanticized the experience. To many, the idea of wandering through mist-shrouded streets was as alluring as it was hazardous. Yet Londoners themselves were divided. Some embraced the cultural mystique, finding pride in the uniqueness of their city's atmosphere. Others resented the trivialization of a hazard that killed neighbors and relatives. For the working poor, who coughed through every winter, the romance of fog seemed grotesque. The tension between art and reality became sharper after the Great Smog of 1952. In the wake of thousands of deaths, cultural portrayals of fog shifted. What had once been seen as atmospheric was now recognized as lethal. Writers and journalists began to abandon the romantic language of mist and mystery. Instead, they described smog in clinical, scientific, and political terms. The fog ceased to be a metaphor for crime or corruption. It became the subject of medical reports and parliamentary debates. Still, the cultural shadow lingered. Even today, the image of fog-shrouded London survives in popular imagination. Films, television series, and novels set in Victorian London almost invariably depict misty streets and glowing gas lamps. The association is so strong that many assume fog remains a defining feature of the city long after clean air laws cleared the skies. The persistence of this imagery reveals how deeply the fog imprinted itself on culture. It became a canvas upon which writers and artists projected themes of mystery, danger, and melancholy. It became shorthand for London itself, a symbol both romantic and sinister. But beneath the beauty of Monet's canvases and the intrigue of Sherlock Holmes lay the suffering of thousands who paid the price of polluted air. The fog's cultural legacy is therefore double-edged. It enriched art, literature, and identity, giving the city a unique atmosphere that fascinated the world. But it also obscured reality, allowing denial to persist and slowing recognition of the crisis. The shadows in culture were not only aesthetic, they were political, hiding the true human toll behind images of beauty and mystery. Today, when tourists imagine Victorian London, they picture fog. They think of Holmes striding down Baker Street, of carriages vanishing into yellow haze, of Monet's painted skies. They rarely think of the children who suffocated in East End slums or the thousands buried after the smogs of 1873, 1891, or 1952. The cultural shadow of fog is powerful, but it is also incomplete. The task of history is to hold both truths together, the allure and the horror, the metaphor and the mortality. London's fog shaped not only its skyline but its imagination. It was muse and murderer, backdrop and executioner. And its story reminds us that culture can both reveal and conceal, casting shadows that linger long after the fog itself is lifted. The fog of London was universal in its reach, but not in its impact. Every citizen, rich or poor, breathed the same acrid air. Yet the burden of disease, death, and disorientation fell far more heavily on those with the least power, the least protection, and the least choice. The fog was a mirror of society itself, exposing the inequalities of class that defined 19th and 20th century London. By the mid-1800s, London was a city of extremes. The West End, with its grand squares and elegant terraces, housed the wealthy elite, aristocrats, industrial magnates, and professionals who could afford comfort. The East End, by contrast, teemed with workers, immigrants, and the destitute, crammed into overcrowded tenements with little sanitation. When fog descended, it cloaked both districts in the same yellow-brown pall. But survival within it depended greatly on class. For the poor, coal was both lifeline and poison. Families in East London relied on the cheapest, dirtiest fuel, low-grade bituminous coal, riddled with sulfur and impurities. It was all they could afford, purchased in small amounts, often by the sack. The smoke from these fires was dense and acrid, filling single-room dwellings where entire families lived, ate, and slept. With poor ventilation, soot-coated walls and lungs alike. Wealthier households, by contrast, could afford cleaner fuels such as coke or anthracite, which burned more efficiently with less smoke. Their chimneys were taller, their houses larger, and their windows better insulated. When the fog crept inside, they could retreat to drawing rooms with heavier curtains and servants tasked with maintaining fires. Their children, though exposed, had stronger chances of surviving winter ailments thanks to better nutrition, medical care, and healthier living conditions. The statistics reveal the stark divide. In the mid-19th century, life expectancy in the East End hovered around 30 years. In the wealthier West End, it was closer to 50. Mortality rates from respiratory illness were dramatically higher in poor districts, where fog compounded already hazardous environments. The Registrar General's reports made clear that disease and death mapped onto geography, and geography mapped onto class. Eyewitness accounts confirmed these realities. In Whitechapel, Bethnal Green, and Poplar, fog was described as a constant companion in winter. Residents coughed throughout the night, their homes filled with smoke even before fog rolled in from outside. Mothers described wiping soot from their children's faces each morning. Doctors in East End hospitals recorded endless cases of bronchitis, pneumonia, and tuberculosis aggravated by polluted air. Meanwhile, in Mayfair or Kensington, the wealthy might lament the inconvenience of carriages delayed or theatres cancelled due to fog. But their mortality rates remained lower, and they had the means to leave the city altogether during severe episodes. Many families maintained country estates and would retreat to cleaner air when London's winters became unbearable. For the working poor, there was no such escape. The inequality extended beyond health. The fog disrupted livelihoods in ways that hit the poor hardest. Dock workers, costermongers, and market traders depended on daily labor in the open air. When fog halted transport in closed markets, their income vanished instantly. A week of fog could mean a week without wages, with no reserves to fall back on. For the rich, business was delayed but rarely destroyed. For the poor, survival itself was at stake. Children in poorer districts bore particular hardship. School attendance dropped sharply during fogs, as parents feared accidents on the walk through blind streets. Those who did attend often sat coughing in unheated classrooms. Childhood illnesses, already rampant, were worsened by the inhalation of polluted air. Mortality among infants in East London soared during foggy winters. Hospitals themselves reflected class divides. The poor relied on overcrowded charity hospitals and infirmaries, where beds were scarce and care limited. Wealthier Londoners accessed private physicians, better equipped facilities, and healthier environments. When the Great Smog of 1952 struck, these differences persisted. Ambulances could not reach working-class districts through the haze, leaving many to die at home. In wealthier neighborhoods, families sometimes managed to secure oxygen or medical assistance. Cultural portrayals of fog often ignored this divide. Novels and paintings depicted fog as a universal experience, enveloping palaces and slums alike. But the reality was that while all could see the haze, not all suffered equally. The aesthetic image of Sherlock Holmes vanishing into Misty Baker Street did little to capture the desperation of families in East End alleys who buried children each winter. The political response also reflected class bias. Early smoke abatement laws targeted large industrial furnaces, but ignored the countless domestic fires burning low-quality coal in working-class homes. The wealthy lobbied against restrictions that might increase the cost of fuel. Reform came slowly, in part because those with the loudest voices, politicians, industrialists, and middle-class reformers, were less exposed to the worst effects. Testimonies from survivors of the Great Smog underscore the inequities. In Stepney, a mother recalled, "The fog came inside. We put towels at the door, but it was no use. My little one coughed until she turned blue. The doctor could not come, and we had no telephone. She died in my arms." In Chelsea, by contrast, a resident wrote, "We stayed indoors and lit the fires. It was dreadful, of course, but we had supplies enough and managed with lanterns. After a few days, the air cleared." The contrast could not be starker. The fog thus became a silent barometer of inequality. It revealed who could shield themselves and who could not, who had power and who had none. It was not simply an atmospheric phenomenon, but a social one, magnifying the divisions already etched into the fabric of London. By the time reforms came in the 1950s, the working poor had endured generations of disproportionate suffering. Clean Air Acts promised relief, but many families had already lost relatives to decades of fog-induced illness. The reforms were victories, but they were also reminders of how long class-based neglect had delayed action. The story of London's fog cannot be told without recognizing its unequal toll. It was not the same experience for all who lived beneath it. For the privileged, fog was inconvenience and metaphor. For the poor, it was death and despair. In the mist, class lines were both blurred and revealed, blurred by the universal cloak of smog, but revealed and emerged alive when the air cleared. For centuries, London prided itself on being a city that never truly rested. Its streets bustled with carts and carriages, its docks loaded and unloaded goods from every corner of the empire, and its factories churned day and night. But when the fog descended, all of that stopped. The city's relentless rhythm fell silent, paralyzed by a force no government or industry could control. The most immediate impact of fog was on transport. Visibility dropped to inches, and with it, mobility collapsed. Carriages and later motorcars were abandoned mid-route. Drivers could not see the horses in front of them or the road beneath their wheels. Accidents multiplied until it became safer to stop altogether. Eyewitnesses described streets littered with stranded vehicles, horses trembling in confusion, and cab drivers leading their animals by hand through the haze. By the late 19th century, when trains and tram carried millions across the capital, fog disrupted far more than street traffic. Railway stations, once symbols of industrial efficiency, ground to a halt. Signals were invisible. Drivers, unable to see the track ahead, slowed to a crawl or refused to move at all. Collisions occurred with tragic regularity. One notorious crash near Kentish Town in 1876 killed a dozen people when fog concealed a standing train from the one approaching behind it. At the Thames docks, fog froze commerce. Ships delayed entering the river, fearing collisions in the murky waters. Barges drifted aimlessly, unable to locate moorings. Merchants complained of perishable goods spoiling as cargo sat idle. For a city whose wealth depended on trade, each fog was a reminder how fragile its lifelines could be. The 20th century did not bring relief. Motorized buses replaced horse-drawn omnibuses, but the problem was the same. In the Great Smog of 1952, London Transport attempted to keep buses running, but drivers could not see more than a few feet ahead. In desperation, conductors walked in front of vehicles with lanterns, guiding them through streets at walking pace. Even so, most services were abandoned. Trains stood idle at stations, and flights were cancelled across southern England. The paralysis extended beyond transport. Public institutions faltered. Schools often closed, sending children home early for fear they might become lost on the way back. Courts adjourned sessions when witnesses failed to arrive. Theaters canceled performances as audiences could not find their way or dared not travel. Even funerals were delayed, with hearses unable to navigate the fog. Commerce slowed to a crawl. Shopkeepers lamented empty tills as customers stayed home. Markets lay deserted, their stalls invisible in the gloom. Delivermen could not locate addresses. Letters piled up at sorting offices, undelivered until the fog lifted. Each episode cost the city thousands of pounds, a hidden tax on its prosperity. The impact reached into homes as well. Milk deliveries failed, leaving families without essentials. Coal merchants struggled to find customers' houses, forcing households to ration what fuel they had left. In working-class neighborhoods, where food was purchased daily rather than stored, fog meant hunger. Families who lived hand-to-mouth could ill afford even a few days of disruption. Hospitals, overwhelmed by patients struggling to breathe, also suffered from shortages. Ambulances often could not reach homes, forcing relatives to carry the sick through the streets. Doctors reported arriving hours late to calls, guided only by voices in the darkness. One physician recalled stumbling into lampposts repeatedly on a journey that normally took minutes. Even the routines of government faltered. Civil servants found themselves unable to reach Whitehall. Parliamentary debates were delayed. In December 1952, as the Great Smog suffocated London, the machinery of state slowed, even as thousands of citizens were dying. The very power that ran the empire was not immune to paralysis. The sensory details of these stoppages were unforgettable. Silence descended on normally busy thoroughfares, broken only by coughing or the cries of disoriented pedestrians. Gas lamps glowed faintly, halos swallowed by murk. The smell of sulfur clung to clothing and hair. London, a city defined by noise and movement, seemed suspended in time. Eyewitnesses recorded the eerie stillness. A journalist of the Times in 1880 wrote, "The city has ceased to move. Omnibuses stand like specters in the streets, their horses stamping nervously. Shops lie empty, their owners peering out into a void. The only sound is a whistle of a constable, answered by another far off, both blind in the darkness." The stillness was not only physical but psychological. Londoners described the fog as suffocating not just to the lungs but to the spirit. The sense of isolation, of being cut off even from one's own street, created unease. Strangers collided without warning, startled at the sudden appearance of another figure. Families huddled indoors, listening for news that could not travel. The fog turned the world inward, forcing a metropolis of millions into silence and stillness. This paralysis carried broader implications. A city that ruled a global empire found itself undone by its own air. The fog revealed the vulnerability of industrial modernity. The trains, ships, and factories that symbolized progress could all be stopped by the very pollution they produced. The smog was not just a health hazard, but a challenge to London's identity as a hub of unstoppable commerce and power. The Great Smog of 1952 brought this vulnerability into full view. For 5 days, London was immobilized. With transport halted, hospitals overwhelmed, and businesses closed, the city resembled a ghost town. Morgues overflowed, funerals were delayed, and even communication faltered as telephone lines jammed with desperate calls. It was one of the few moments in modern history when London, the capital of empire, simply stopped. The legacy of these stoppages lived on in memory. Older Londoners recalled with unease the days when buses stood idle, trains refused to move, and markets lay silent. The image of a city brought to its knees by fog became part of London's identity, a reminder that its power was fragile, and its progress came at immense cost. In the silence of fog-bound streets, London's dependence on movement and trade was laid bare. The stoppages revealed not only inconvenience but vulnerability. They forced the city to confront the truth, that unchecked industrial growth could paralyze the very system it had built. The fogs of London had haunted the city for more than a century. They were endured, joked about, romanticized in literature, and reluctantly accepted as a price of modern life. But by December 1952, the cost was no longer possible to ignore. The Great Smog, the deadliest of them all, marked the turning point, the moment when denial gave way to recognition, and recognition to reform. When the fog lifted on December 9, 1952, London was left in stunned silence. In its wake lay a city suffocated. Funeral homes struggled to cope with the surge of bodies. Hospitals remained overwhelmed, even as new admissions slowed. Families buried relatives who had been healthy only days before. The disaster was visible everywhere, in black creep on doors, in long lines of mourners, and in the exhausted faces of doctors and nurses who had worked without rest. Yet at first, the scale of the tragedy was obscured. Government officials released cautious figures. 4,000 dead, they said, a grim number but not unprecedented in a city so vast. The narrative was that London had endured a terrible but temporary event. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, still deeply committed to coal as Britain's industrial backbone, resisted calls for immediate change. To acknowledge that the nation's fuel was a public killer was politically unthinkable. But doctors and scientists knew differently. In hospitals across the capital, physicians had seen the surge firsthand. Respiratory wards filled beyond capacity. Mortality rates spiked not gradually, but explosively, within hours of the fog descending. Doctors like Dr. Horace Giles of the Central Middlesex Hospital began speaking out, linking the deaths directly to air pollution. Their voices carried weight, and their testimonies contradicted the government's reassurances. The press, too, pressed the issue. Newspapers published eyewitness accounts of chaos, buses stranded in the streets, animals collapsing in markets, children lost in the gloom, and families suffocating in their own homes. They highlighted the words of nurses who had run out of oxygen tanks, forced to watch patients die gasping for breath. The narrative of inconvenience gave way to a story of catastrophe. Epidemiologists soon confirmed the suspicions. The Registrar General's office analyzed mortality data and found shocking patterns. Deaths had doubled during the smog, concentrated among the elderly, infants, and those with pre-existing respiratory illness. Later research pushed the number even higher. suggesting that as many as 12,000 people had died as a direct result, with many more suffering long-term illness. The public response was profound. Unlike earlier fogs, which faded from memory as quickly as they cleared, the Great Smog lingered in the mind. It was not a mystery or a metaphor, but a disaster witnessed by millions. Families had buried too many loved ones for the event to be dismissed. The normal cycle of denial, the jokes, the resignation, collapsed under the weight of grief. This shift in public perception created political pressure. In Parliament, questions were raised with unusual urgency. How could Britain, a modern nation that prided itself on progress, allow thousands to die from breathing the air of its capital? The opposition pressed for inquiries. Backbenchers demanded accountability. The silence that had long surrounded air pollution was broken. Yet the process was not immediate. For 4 years after the Great Smog, governments hesitated. Industry lobbied fiercely, warning of the cost of reform. Coal was still central to Britain's economy, supplying homes, factories, and power stations. Any move to regulate it threatened jobs, revenue, and energy security. The inertia of habit and vested interest remained powerful, but the evidence would not fade. Each winter brought renewed anxiety. In 1956, another severe smog event struck, though less deadly than that of 1952. This second blow reinforced the urgency of action. By then, scientific reports had multiplied, showing that London's air pollution levels were far beyond what human health could tolerate. Public patience had worn thin. The Clean Air Act of 1956 emerged as the response. Though modest by later standards, it was revolutionary for its time. It established smokeless zones in urban areas, requiring households and industries to switch to cleaner fuels like gas, electricity, and smokeless coke. It restricted the burning of raw coal in homes, incentivized technological improvements in industry, and created a framework for government oversight of air quality. The act did not eliminate smog overnight. Enforcement was gradual, and poor families often struggled to afford cleaner fuels. But it marked the beginning of the end. Over the following decade, the frequency and severity of London's fogs diminished sharply. By the late 1960s, the pea super had virtually disappeared from the city. The turning point of 1952 was not simply a moment of tragedy. It was a moment of realization. It forced Britain to confront the reality that unchecked industrial progress carried human costs too great to bear. It demonstrated the power of science and medicine to challenge denial and shape policy. And it marked the birth of modern environmental consciousness in Britain, a recognition that the health of the nation depended on the air it breathed. For Londoners who survived, the memory of the Great Smog never faded. It haunted them not as a romantic vision of gas lamps and mystery, but as days of silence, suffocation, and death. They remembered streets brought to a halt, hospitals overflowing, and loved ones buried without warning. They understood, more than anyone, that the fog had always been a killer, and that only by acknowledging it as such could change come. The turning point was not inevitable. It was won by grief, by the persistence of scientists, and by public pressure that forced reluctant politicians to act. Without it, the cycle of denial might have continued for decades more. The Clean Air Act was a legislative milestone, but it was built on the tragedy of thousands whose deaths exposed the price of complacency. In the end, the Great Smog of 1952 marked the moment when London chose life over smoke, when the shadow of denial lifted, and when the city began to reclaim its air. It was a turning point not only for London, but for environmental policy worldwide, a lesson written in the haze that suffocated a city into change. The Great Smog of 1952 had left London shaken. In its immediate aftermath, grief dominated the city. Thousands of funerals filled churchyards, and newspapers printed obituary after obituary. The memory of those 5 days lingered in the smell of smoke-stained curtains, the stains on walls and ceilings, and the silence of homes where loved ones had died. Yet out of that grief came momentum. The aftermath of the Great Smog became the beginning of real reform. In the years that followed, scientists, journalists, and politicians debated not whether smog was dangerous, but what to do about it. The denial that had shaped earlier decades finally crumbled. The statistics were too stark. Studies published by the Medical Research Council in 1954 confirmed the deadly effects of air pollution, showing that mortality had spiked in direct proportion to sulfur dioxide and smoke levels. The report left little room for doubt. London's fogs were not natural curiosities. but man-made disasters. Public opinion shifted quickly. For generations, Londoners had treated fog as an inconvenience, a nuisance, or even a romantic hallmark of their city. But now it was viewed with dread. Families who had lost children or grandparents in 1952 wrote to their MPs demanding change. Civic groups petitioned Parliament. Local councils called for national action, recognizing that piecemeal efforts could not address a problem that blanketed the entire metropolis. The government could not ignore this pressure forever. In 1956, after years of debate, Parliament passed the Clean Air Act, one of the most significant pieces of environmental legislation in modern British history. It was not a single sweeping measure, but a framework designed to reshape urban life gradually. At its core was the creation of smokeless zones. Within these areas, households and industries were prohibited from burning raw coal. Instead, they were required to use smokeless fuels such as coke, gas, or electricity. This change directly targeted domestic pollution, which had long been the greatest contributor to London's fogs. The Act also provided grants to households to help with the cost of converting fireplaces and installing new heating systems. For poorer families, these grants were essential. Without them, cleaner fuels would have remained out of reach. The government recognized, at last, that reform could not succeed if it placed the greatest burden on those already most exposed. Industries, too, faced new restrictions. Power stations and factories were required to adopt cleaner technologies, reduce emissions, or relocate away from densely populated areas. While business leaders initially resisted, many adapted, and innovation followed. The Act did not end coal use overnight, but it signaled a shift away from the daintiest forms of energy. Implementation took time. Enforcement varied by district, and old habits died hard. Many households continued burning coal for years, either out of necessity or tradition. The fog did not vanish immediately, but over the following decade, the result became visible. By the early 1960s, the frequency of dense smogs had declined sharply. By the 1970s, the iconic pea supers of London had disappeared almost entirely. The Clean Air Act also had symbolic power. It marked a turning point in the relationship between government, environment, and public health. For the first time, the state accepted responsibility for protecting citizens from the air they breathed. It was an admission that progress could not come at any cost, that industrial prosperity had to be balanced against human survival. The reforms inspired similar measures abroad. Other industrial cities, from Los Angeles to Tokyo, studied Britain's example. In the decades that followed, international agreements on air quality and pollution drew upon the lessons of London. The Great Smog became not only a national tragedy, but a global case study in environmental reform. The aftermath also reshaped London's identity. For centuries, fog had been central to the city's image, immortalized by Dickens, Doyle, and Monet. Now it was fading, not only from the air but from culture. The London particular lost its mystique, replaced by memories of grief and policy debates. London was no longer the city of mystery fogs, but a city grappling with modern environmental responsibility. The reforms did not solve every problem. Air pollution persisted in new forms, from motor vehicle exhaust, industrial chemicals, and later photochemical smog. But the lethal coal fogs were gone. Life expectancy in the city began to climb. Hospitals reported fewer winter surges of bronchitis deaths. Families no longer feared that stepping outside in December might mean never coming home. For those who lived through the transition, the change was profound. Older Londoners recall with astonishment the clarity of skies in the 1960s. The dome of St. Paul's, once often obscured, gleamed in winter sunlight. Children who had grown up coughing through fogs now played under blue skies. What had once seemed an inescapable fact of life vanished within a generation. The legacy of the Clean Air Act was not only cleaner skies, but a new way of thinking about government responsibility. It demonstrated that reform was possible even in the face of entrenched economic interests. It proved that scientific evidence could drive policy, and it reminded citizens that collective action, born of tragedy, could change the course of history. The aftermath of the Great Smog thus stands as one of London's defining stories. Out of suffocation came clarity, both literal and political. Out of grief came reform that saved untold thousands of future lives. The city that once seemed doomed to choke on its own progress became a pioneer of environmental health. But the memory of 1952 lingered. Survivors carried the trauma of those 5 days for the rest of their lives. They remembered the silence of halted streets, the suffocating air indoors, the funerals that followed. For them, the clearer skies of the 1960s were not just progress. They were proof that the deaths of their loved ones had not been in vain. The Great Smog of 1952 was not only a turning point for London, it was a lesson for the world. For centuries, the fogs of Britain's capital had been treated as curiosities, even cultural emblems. But once the scale of the disaster became undeniable, the international community looked to London as both a warning and an example. Out of tragedy, the world began to rethink the relationship between industry, environment, and human health. By the mid-20th century, air pollution was not unique to London. Across the industrial world, cities choked on smoke. Pittsburgh in the United States was so blackened by soot in the 1940s that residents recalled needing to change clothes midway through the day. Tokyo, Osaka, and Yokohama in Japan suffered similar problems, with coal smoke and industrial fumes turning skies gray. In continental Europe, cities from Paris to Warsaw experienced their own bouts of smog, though rarely on the same scale as London. But what set London apart was the visibility and lethality of its disaster. In December 1952, the images of a capital city brought to its knees by its own air shocked the world. Report of thousands dead made headlines not only in Britain but in the United States, France, Germany, and beyond. Foreign newspapers described London as a city at war with its own atmosphere. Diplomats and journalists who had witnessed the smog firsthand carried stories home, fueling debate abroad. In the United States, the timing was critical. Just 4 years earlier, in 1948, the town of Donora, Pennsylvania, had suffered its own deadly smog when industrial emissions were trapped by a weather inversion. 20 people died and thousands fell ill. The Donora disaster had already sparked scientific investigations into the health effects of pollution. London's tragedy added urgency and global attention. By 1955, the U.S. Congress passed its first federal air pollution legislation, the Air Pollution Control Act. Though limited in scope, focusing on research funding rather than enforcement, it marked the beginning of national recognition. In the following decades, building on the lessons of both Donora and London, the United States developed one of the world's most comprehensive frameworks for clean air, culminating in the Clean Air Act of 1970. Japan, too, drew lessons from London. In the 1950s and 1960s, its cities experienced 4 big pollution diseases caused by unchecked industrial emissions. The British example of smokeless zones and government intervention provided a model for Japanese policymakers when they began introducing environmental regulations in the late 1960s and 1970s. By then, London's experience was frequently cited in Japanese parliamentary debates as evidence of the dangers of inaction. In Europe, London's reforms inspired similar legislation. West Germany introduced stricter air quality laws in the 1960s. France debated industrial emissions policies, often referencing the British example. International conferences on air pollution, increasingly common by the 1960s, placed London at the center of discussion. The Great Smog had transformed Britain from a symbol of pollution into a pioneer of reform. The World Health Organization also took notice. In 1958, the WHO published its first major report on air pollution, drawing directly on the British experience. It highlighted the health consequences of smoke and sulfur dioxide, urging member states to develop monitoring systems and policies. The report framed air pollution as not just a local nuisance, but a global public health challenge. London's tragedy also helped shape the emerging field of environmental science. Epidemiologists refined their methods by analyzing the mortality data of 1952, creating techniques that would later be used worldwide to link pollution with health outcomes. Atmospheric scientists studied the role of temperature inversions, recognizing how weather patterns could trap pollution. These insights informed urban planning and environmental monitoring far beyond Britain. The symbolic impact was just as powerful. For decades, London fog had been romanticized in novels and films. After 1952, it became a symbol of industrial danger. Rioters and activists used it as shorthand for the perils of unchecked growth. The fog shifted from a cultural cliché to a warning, a reminder that progress could turn deadly if left unregulated. By the late 20th century, environmental movements across the globe cited London as proof of the need for action. Campaigns against acid rain in North America, against coal dependence in Eastern Europe, and against toxic smog in Asia all invoked the memory of the Great Smog. London became both cautionary tale and inspiration, a city that had nearly choked to death, but which had also pioneered a way forward. The global legacy extended into law and diplomacy. International agreements on air quality, including those under the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe in the 1970s and 1980s, echoed principles first enshrined in Britain's Clean Air Act, that pollution could cross borders, that governments had a duty to act, and that cleaner technology was both possible and necessary. The irony was not lost on observers. The very city once defined by its fogs became a model for environmental reform. Tourists in the 1970s were astonished to find London's skies clear. The pea souper, once immortalized in paintings and detective stories, was gone. What remained was its reputation and its lesson. London's fog had taught the world that air could kill, that denial carried a price in human lives, and that reform was possible. From Pittsburgh to Tokyo, from Brussels to Los Angeles, policymakers invoked the specter of 1952 as they crafted their own laws. Few cities wanted to repeat London's mistake. The story of the Great Smog thus transcends Britain. It is not just London's tragedy, but the world's warning. Out of its suffocating gloom came a new global awareness that the atmosphere is fragile, that pollution knows no borders, and that the health of nations depends on the air they share. The fogs of London may have lifted more than half a century ago, but their shadow has never entirely disappeared. The Great Smog of 1952 remains a defining moment in environmental history, not only for Britain, but for the world. Its echoes still shape how governments, scientists, and citizens think about the air they breathe. In the decades after the Clean Air Act of 1956, London transformed. The dense pea soupers that had once defined the city's winters became rare and eventually vanished. By the 1970s, the iconic imagery of yellow-brown haze swallowing the Thames belonged more to memory and literature than daily life. For many, this was proof of progress, a sign that humanity could learn from disaster and reform its environment. Yet while the visible fogs disappeared, pollution itself did not. The sources shifted. By the late 20th century, coal fires were no longer the dominant culprit. Instead, motor vehicles, industrial chemicals, and modern energy systems introduced new pollutants. Nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, and fine particulate matter, invisible to the naked eye, replaced the soot and sulfur that had once stained London's walls. This new pollution was less dramatic, but no less dangerous. Studies in the 1990s and 2000s revealed that long-term exposure to fine particulates could shorten life expectancy, cause chronic illnesses, and burden health systems in ways reminiscent of the Victorian and post-war smogs. Unlike the thick fogs of the past, these pollutants did not shut down cities in dramatic fashion. They worked silently, invisibly, and persistently. The legacy of 1952, however, provided a framework for understanding. Policymakers and activists often invoked the Great Smog when campaigning for modern reforms. The tragedy had taught that waiting for undeniable catastrophe meant paying in lives. Prevention, monitoring, and regulation were essential. London itself introduced new measures, congestion charges, low emission zones, and stricter monitoring of vehicle emissions. These were direct descendants of the spirit of reform born in the 1950s. Globally, the echoes were even louder. Cities in China, India, and other rapidly industrializing nations experienced their own air quality crises in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Images of Beijing and New Delhi shrouded in toxic haze recalled London's past. Journalists and scientists repeatedly compared them to the Great Smog. For many, London's story was not just history, it was prophecy. International agencies, from the World Health Organization to the United Nations, continue to cite the Great Smog as a milestone. Reports on air pollution frequently include London's experience as both cautionary tale and model of reform. The disaster's memory reminds policymakers that clean air laws, though costly, are far cheaper than mass death. In Britain itself, the echoes are personal. Survivors of the Great Smog, now elderly, still recall the days when the air turned deadly. Their testimonies, recorded in oral history projects, preserve the human face of environmental failure. They describe the smell of sulfur in their clothes, the darkness at midday, the funerals that followed. Their voices ensure that the smog is remembered not only as data in reports, but as lived experience. The cultural memory also endures. Films, television dramas, and documentaries revisit the smog, weaving it into stories of post-war Britain. Novels and plays continue to use fog as symbol, though now often with explicit reference to its dangers. The romantic haze of Dickens has been replaced by the lethal pull of 1952. Perhaps the most powerful echo lies in climate change. The Great Smog was, in one sense, an early warning of what happens when human activity overwhelms natural systems. It showed how industrial growth, if unchecked, could destabilize life itself. Today, as the world faces rising temperatures, shifting weather patterns, and new forms of pollution, the lessons of London resonate deeply. The fog was local. Climate change is global. But the principle is the same. Denial delays action, and delay costs lives. The legacy also complicates identity. Londoners once wore their fogs as a badge of uniqueness, something that set their city apart. Now, the memory is more sobering. It is a reminder of vulnerability, of mistakes made, of suffering endured. But it is also a reminder of resilience, of the capacity to change, to legislate, to learn. The city that nearly choked itself to death became a pioneer of environmental reform. That paradox continues to shape how London understands itself. In schools, the Great Smog is taught not only as history, but as part of science education, a case study in the consequences of pollution. In museums, it appears in exhibitions about industrialization and the environment. In politics, it is referenced in debates about everything from traffic emissions to climate targets. The fog may be gone, but its echoes are institutionalized. The very phrase London smog has shifted in meaning. Once, it described the thick yellow haze of coal smoke. Now, it is a shorthand for environmental disaster, invoked whenever air pollution makes headlines anywhere in the world. The city's suffering has become part of the global vocabulary of environmental awareness. Yet the danger of forgetting remains. Because today's pollutants are invisible, the urgency can fade. There are no longer 5 days when the city stops, no sudden spikes of mortality that make front-page news. Instead, the danger is gradual, cumulative, and easy to ignore. The lesson of London is that invisibility does not mean safety. The echo of 1952 insists that action must come before catastrophe, not after. In the end, the Great Smog is more than a historical episode. It is a continuing dialogue between past and present, between the mistakes of one generation and the responsibilities of the next. Its shadows fall not only on the streets of London, but on every city where the air grows thick and health falters. It reminds us that progress and survival must walk hand in hand, and that the price of forgetting is too high to pay. Long after the fogs themselves vanished, their presence lingered, in stories, in art, in identity. London's fog became more than an environmental condition. It became a myth, a symbol, and a cultural shorthand. Even today, when the skies over the city are clearer than they have been for centuries, the memory of the London fog endures. The roots of this memory stretch back long, before the Great Smog of 1952. In the 19th century, fog was woven deeply into London's cultural fabric. Writers, poets, and painters had already transformed it into metaphor. Charles Dickens made fog synonymous with confusion and corruption in Bleak House. Arthur Conan Doyle used it as the atmospheric backdrop for Sherlock Holmes, setting crimes against the yellow gloom of Baker Street. Painters such as J.M.W. Turner and Claude Monet captured London's haze as both beautiful and mysterious. By the time the 20th century began, fog was already myth. But myths evolved, and after 1952, the meaning shifted. What had once been romantic, atmospheric, even exotic became sinister, suffocating, and tragic. The Great Smog exposed the cause of what culture had long portrayed as picturesque. A phenomenon once admired was revealed as deadly. This tension between romance and reality is at the heart of fog's myth in London memory. Popular culture illustrates the divide. Films produced in the early 20th century almost always included fog when depicting London, whether in detective stories, horror films, or romantic dramas. Fog was shorthand for mystery and intrigue, a visual cue that a story was unfolding in Britain's capital. After 1952, however, depictions changed. Documentaries, novels, and later dramatizations of the Great Smog portrayed fog not as mystery but as menace. The fog became villain, not atmosphere. Even so, nostalgia persisted. Many Londoners, especially those who had not experienced the worst episodes, continued to speak of fog with a kind of affection. In oral histories, older residents often described the atmosphere of gas lamps glowing faintly in the mist of familiar streets transformed into strange dreamscapes. For them, the fog was inconvenient but also unforgettable. The myth survived alongside the memory of suffering. This duality extended beyond Britain. Abroad, the image of London remained inseparable from fog long after the smogs themselves had gone. Hollywood films set in Victorian London still portrayed carriages vanishing into mist. Tourists visiting in the 1960s and 1970s were often surprised to find clear skies, disappointed that the London particular of novels and films no longer existed. The myth had outlived the reality. Historians and cultural critics have noted that fog functioned as a metaphor for modernity itself. It represented both the progress of industrialization and its costs. It concealed as much as it revealed, making the city at once exciting and dangerous. This symbolic role explains why it has proven so resilient in collective memory. Fog was never just weather, it was a cultural language. The myth also served psychological purposes. For a city that endured centuries of pollution, fog provides a way of remembering without dwelling solely on tragedy. It allows Londoners to frame their past in images of atmosphere and mystery, while the deeper reality of disease and death is confined to history books. In this sense, myth softens memory, making the unbearable bearable. Yet the darker memory resurfaces at key moments. The anniversaries of the Great Smog, particularly the 50th in 2002, prompted renewed discussion of the human cost. Documentaries interviewed survivors, ensuring that the tragedy was not lost beneath the romance. Public health campaigns invoked the memory as warning, reminding citizens that air can still kill. In this way, the fog's myth remains tethered to its truth. The endurance of fog in literature and media continues into the present. Contemporary novels set in Victorian London almost invariably include descriptions of misty streets, even though historians note that such depictions exaggerate frequency and intensity. Television dramas like Ripper Street or adaptations of Sherlock Holmes rely heavily on fog as visual shorthand, reinforcing the myth for new generations. The persistence of these portrayals shows how deeply fog is entwined with London's identity. Museums and exhibitions play a role in sustaining memory. Displays at the Museum of London and the Science Museum highlight fog, both as cultural icon and environmental disaster. Photographs of children wearing masks in 1952 sit alongside paintings of Monet's Misty Thames. The juxtaposition reflects the duality: fog as beauty, fog as killer. The myth also shapes language. Even today, the word smog evokes London in the global imagination. Journalists reporting on pollution crises in Beijing, Delhi, or Mexico City frequently compare them to London in the 1950s. The fog has become metaphor not only for London, but for urban pollution worldwide. Its memory is global. The persistence of fog in memory and myth demonstrates the power of cultural narrative. A city's experience of disaster does not vanish when a disaster ends. It becomes part of its identity, shaping how it is seen by the world and how it sees itself. For London, fog is both shame and symbol, tragedy and tradition. In the end, the memory of London fog is layered. It is nostalgia for atmosphere, mourning for lives lost, pride in reform, and warning for the future. It is myth built on memory, and memory wrapped in myth. The fog may have lifted, but it still hangs in the imagination, a permanent haze over the story of London. For more than a century, London's fogs defined the city. They colored its skies, filled its lungs, shaped its culture, and claimed its lives. From the first reports of coal smoke mingling with mist in the 17th century, through the thick pea soups of the 19th, to the deadly Great Smog of 1952, the story of London was inseparable from the story of its air. But by the mid-20th century, the curtain had finally begun to close. The Great Smog had changed everything. In its aftermath, denial gave way to recognition. The Clean Air Act of 1956, followed by further reforms in the 1960s and 1970s, transformed how the city breathed. The air cleared. The skies lightened. St. Paul's Cathedral could once again be seen from miles away. By the 1980s, the iconic fog that had once seemed eternal had disappeared almost entirely. London was no longer the city of suffocating haze. This transformation was not just environmental but cultural. For generations, fog had been a symbol of London's identity, shaping how it was seen by the world and how it saw itself. Writers like Dickens and Doyle had immortalized it as atmosphere. Artists like Monet had painted it as beauty. Politicians had ignored it as nuisance. But after 1952, its meaning shifted. Fog was remembered as tragedy, as failure, as warning. The romance was gone, replaced by a sober recognition of the costs of industrial growth. And yet, the myth endured. Even as skies cleared, depictions of fog persisted in novels, films, and television dramas. Sherlock Holmes remained cloaked in mist. Victorian London, in the public imagination, never lost its yellow haze. The cultural image of fog survived, even as the physical reality vanished. This duality, myth versus memory, culture versus history, became part of fog's legacy. The curtain closing on London's fog also opened a new chapter in environmental awareness. The Clean Air Act was among the first modern environmental laws, setting precedents that would echo worldwide. The disaster of 1952 became a global lesson, shaping debates in Washington, Tokyo, Paris, and beyond. London's tragedy showed that the costs of inaction were measured in human lives, and that reform, though politically difficult, was possible. For Londoners, the end of fog brought relief but also reflection. The older generation remembered lives lost, funerals hurried, hospitals overwhelmed. Survivors carried those memories for decades, their stories a living reminder of what had been endured. For younger generations, fog became history, something read about in school, seen in old photographs, or dramatized on screen. The lived experience faded, but the story remained. In closing the curtain on fog, London revealed a deeper truth about itself. It was a city capable of great resilience, but also one that had long tolerated suffering in the name of progress. The fog was not inevitable. It was man-made, born of coal and complacency, allowed to persist because it was profitable, familiar, and culturally accepted. Only tragedy forced change. The lesson was clear. Nature may forgive delay, but human lives do not. That lesson resonates still. Around the world, cities continue to struggle with pollution. Beijing, Delhi, and Mexico City have all endured their own modern smogs, often compared directly to London's. Climate change raises new questions about humanity's relationship with its environment. And each time, the story of London's fog is invoked, as warning, as precedent, as reminder. Closing the curtain does not mean forgetting. It means recognizing the arc of history, from ignorance to acceptance, from tragedy to reform, from memory to myth. London's fog has become all of these at once. It is a story of human cost, cultural identity, political struggle, and eventual change. It is proof that progress comes not just from invention, but from reflection and responsibility. As the final curtain falls on the age of London fog, what remains is not the haze itself, but its imprint. It lingers in literature and art, in public health policy, in global awareness, and in the collective memory of a city that once lived in darkness. The fog has lifted, but the story remains, a cautionary tale, a cultural legacy, and a testament to the resilience of a city that finally chose clear skies over suffocating air. The curtain closes, but the echo endures.